Danger might be closer than you think. Before we begin, like this video, comment where and what time you're watching from, and subscribe for more chilling stories. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into the unknown. Story 1. I was never the kind of person to believe in weird, unexplained things. I liked facts, logic, things that made sense. Back in the summer of 2019, my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip in the Smoky Mountains. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Danny, his girlfriend Lisa, and our 2 other buddies, Marcus and Evan. We'd done this plenty of times before, always chasing that feeling of being out in nature, away from the noise of the city. That weekend was supposed to be like any other, drinking cheap beer by the fire, telling dumb stories, and hiking until our legs gave out. But there's one night I still can't explain. One night that still messes with my head to this day. It was late, maybe around 1 a.m. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers at that point, and we were sitting in a circle talking about nothing in particular. The air was crisp, cool enough that you could see your breath if you exhaled hard. Everything around us was still, just the occasional crack of a twig in the distance, maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. Then we heard it, clear as day, a voice calling from the woods. "Guys, help! I think I'm lost." It was Marcus's voice. Every single one of us heard it. The panic, the strain in his tone like he had been running. My stomach dropped as I turned to look at him, because Marcus was sitting right next to me. I could see the color drain from his face. His hands gripped his knees so hard his knuckles went white. He was here, but his voice was out there. Nobody spoke for a second. We just sat there, staring into the darkness where the voice had come from. Then it called again, only this time it sounded wrong. "Guys, help me. I'm lost." The exact same words, but the cadence was slightly off. Too perfect, like someone playing back a recording. My skin prickled. Lisa grabbed Danny's arm, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. Marcus looked like he was about to be sick. Evan, always the skeptic, muttered, "Must be an echo," but even he didn't sound convinced. An echo doesn't mimic speech patterns. An echo doesn't move closer. But this voice did. We all heard it. Closer now, maybe 20 feet away. "Guys, help! I think I'm lost." The same words, the same tone, but with something hollow underneath it. Something that didn't belong in a human voice. I don't know why I did it, but I called out, "Marcus is right here. Who the hell are you?" The second I spoke, the forest went silent. Not just quiet, silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Just a thick, suffocating stillness that made my pulse hammer in my ears. I had never felt fear like that before. Not the kind that makes your body lock up, your instincts screaming at you to run but your legs refusing to move. Then, from the darkness, something responded. "Marcus is right here." But it wasn't a question. It was a perfect copy of my voice. My whole body went cold. It wasn't just repeating anymore. It was responding. It had heard me. It knew we were listening. I turned to my friends, expecting someone to say something, to give me some kind of explanation. But all I saw were wide eyes and tense shoulders. Marcus had his hand over his mouth, like he was trying not to breathe too loud. Lisa was shaking her head, whispering "no" over and over. I think that was the moment we all realized at the same time that whatever was out there wasn't human. Danny grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only stretched so far before fading into blackness. "If this is a joke, it's not funny," he called out. No response. For a few seconds, nothing happened. And then, all at once, the voice returned. Except now, it wasn't just repeating us. It was layering our voices, speaking all at once, overlapping in a sick, distorted chorus. My voice, Marcus's voice, Danny's, even Lisa's choked whispers. We scrambled to our feet, adrenaline spiking through our bodies. Evan, the only one, still gripping onto logic, hissed, "It's gotta be someone messing with us." But his voice shook when he said it. The flashlight flickered as Danny swung it wildly between the trees, trying to catch movement. For a split second I thought I saw something, a shape tall and thin standing between the trunks. But when I blinked, it was gone. Then, the voice whispered, this time right behind us, "Guys, Help me, I'm lost. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe it was Lisa, maybe it was me, but the second that whisper came from behind us, we bolted. No words, no plan, just pure instinct. We grabbed whatever we could, flashlights, backpacks, anything within reach, and ran. The fire was still burning, casting warped shadows as we sprinted past it, but none of us cared. We just needed to get out. The hike back to the car was supposed to take 20 minutes. I swear it felt like hours. Every step I took, I expected to hear that voice again, to feel a cold hand wrap around my wrist, to turn and see. God, I don't even know what I expected to see. But the woods stayed silent. Too silent. Not the natural kind of quiet, but an unnatural, oppressive void, like even the forest was holding its breath. We didn't talk until we were back in the car, doors locked, headlights cutting through the darkness. No one wanted to be the first to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. That wasn't an echo. That wasn't a prank. And whatever it was, it had learned our voices. It had spoken to us. None of us have been back to that campsite since. I don't think we ever will. But sometimes on still nights when the world outside is quiet, I swear I hear it again. My own voice calling for help from somewhere in the dark. Story 2. I've been camping alone for years. It started as a way to clear my head after long work weeks. Just me, my gear, and the silence of the woods. I love the solitude, the way the trees seemed to swallow up the rest of the world, the way the night stretched out endlessly when there was no phone buzzing, no traffic humming in the background. I thought I knew the forest well. I thought I understood the kind of peace that only comes from being alone. But last year, I learned that just because you're alone doesn't mean you're alone. It was late September, one of my last solo trips before winter made it too miserable to sleep outside. I had set up camp in a small clearing deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a spot I'd been to once before. Nothing but trees. For miles, no trails, no signs of other campers. Just perfect, undisturbed nature. I spent the day hiking, fishing in a nearby stream, enjoying the crisp air. As the sun set, I made a small fire, ate, and settled into my tent with a book. Everything felt normal, peaceful. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. No reason, just that strange, sudden alertness that sometimes happens when you're sleeping outdoors. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the trees, or maybe an animal in the brush. But then I noticed something off. The tent flap was open. Not wide, just enough to make my stomach twist. I always zip it shut before sleeping. Always. My first thought was that I had just forgotten, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. I reached for my flashlight and scanned the area just outside my tent. My campsite looked untouched. The fire had burned down to embers. My backpack was still where I left it. But as I swept the light across my small camp, my stomach dropped. My gear had been moved. Not stolen, not rummaged through, just rearranged. My boots, which had been by the tent door, were now placed neatly by the fire pit. My cooking utensils were stacked beside them, lined up perfectly. Even my backpack, still zipped, had been shifted about 2 feet to the left. I sat there for what felt like forever, gripping my flashlight so hard my fingers ached. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal, maybe? But why would a raccoon or a bear rearrange my stuff instead of steering through it? A person? That thought sent a chill through me. I was miles from the nearest road and I hadn't seen another soul all day. If someone had found me out here, that meant they had walked deep into the woods, in the dark, without a flashlight, just to silently move my things around. I forced myself to take deep breaths, trying to think rationally. Maybe I had done it in my sleep? Maybe I had woken up disoriented, moved things around, and then gone back to bed without remembering. It wasn't logical, but it was better than the alternative. Either way, I wasn't going back to sleep. I double-checked that my knife was within reach, zipped my tent up all the way, and sat there listening to the forest. It was dead quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the faintest sound of fabric shifting. It was subtle, like someone brushing against the side of the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound was slow, deliberate, like fingertips dragging across the nylon. Then, silence. Not the comforting kind, the heavy, unnatural kind, the kind that makes your body scream at you to run. I wanted to check outside, but a deeper part of me, the one still ruled by instinct, told me not to. Whatever was out there wanted me to react, to acknowledge it. So I stayed still, gripping my knife under the covers, barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I must have drifted off again. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to rise and everything looked normal. But the second I stepped out of my tent, my stomach dropped. Every single one of my belongings had been moved again. This time it was even more deliberate. My boots were side by side, pointed toward the trees. My cooking gear was stacked neatly, like someone had taken their time arranging it. But the worst part? My backpack. It had been unzipped, not wide open. Just enough for someone or something to have looked inside. I checked everything. Nothing was missing, nothing was taken, just touched, moved. That was somehow worse. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my camera. I had set it up on a small tripod outside my tent the night before, facing the campfire. If something had been out there, I would have caught it. I hit play and watched as the footage showed me exactly what I had expected, but hoped not to see. Sometime around 3 a.m. the fire barely flickering. A shape appeared. Not walking, not approaching from the woods, just there. Like it had stepped into existence mid-frame. Tall, thin, completely motionless. It stood at the edge of the light, its face impossible to make out, but I could feel it watching. Then, after a few minutes, it moved, not toward my tent, but toward my belongings. Slow, deliberate movements, like someone setting a dinner table. It touched everything. It lingered. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No footsteps, no exit, just gone. I didn't bother packing properly. I shoved everything into my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and left. I didn't look back. I didn't stop walking until I saw my car, and even then I locked the doors the second I got in. I've camped plenty of times since then, but never alone. Never again. Because now I know I was never alone to begin with. Story 3. I never considered myself superstitious. I grew up in a small town, the kind where people tell stories about haunted houses and strange things in the woods, but I never paid much attention. That changed 3 years ago. My daughter Sophie was 6 at the time, and I had taken her on a weekend camping trip in northern Michigan. It was supposed to be a simple father-daughter getaway, just us, a tent, and a couple of days by the lake. But something happened that night, something I still don't understand. And if I'm being honest, I don't think I want to understand. We set up camp in a clearing near an old abandoned lodge. I knew about it beforehand. Some worn-down structure from the 1940s, long since reclaimed by the forest. It was about a quarter mile from our site, hidden behind the trees, and I figured it would be something cool to explore during the day. Sophie was excited, running around, gathering sticks, asking me a million questions about what kind of animals lived in the woods. Everything felt normal, peaceful. That night, after roasting marshmallows and telling silly ghost stories, we settled into the tent. Sophie fell asleep fast, curled up in her sleeping bag with her little stuffed fox tucked under her arm. I laid there for a while, listening to the night sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind. It wasn't until around 2 a.m. that I woke up, groggy and disoriented, to the sound of Sophie's voice. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging at my arm. "They won't stop talking." I blinked the sleep away, my brain struggling to catch up. "Who won't stop talking, sweetheart?" I murmured, still half asleep. "The kids," she said, her little face barely visible in the dim light of the tent. "They're outside." That woke me up fast. I sat up, listening. At first, all I could hear was the normal sounds of the woods. But then I noticed something off. The rustling of the leaves wasn't random. It came in short bursts, like the quiet shuffling of feet. The wind wasn't strong, but there was a faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. It was impossible to make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Soft, murmuring voices, overlapping and blending together. My stomach twisted. We were miles from the nearest campground. There shouldn't have been anyone else out there, especially not children. I reached for the flashlight, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the clearing, the abandoned fire pit. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. But the second I turned the light off, the whispering started again. Closer this time. A cold dread settled in my chest. I wasn't the kind of person to get spooked easily, but something about this felt wrong on a level I couldn't explain. I turned back to Sophie, who was still sitting up in her sleeping bag. Her wide eyes locked onto me. "Do you see them?" I whispered. She hesitated for a second, then slowly shook her head. "No, but I hear them. They keep asking. If we want to play." My hands tightened around the flashlight. I didn't know what to do. If there were other people out there, I needed to confront them. But what kind of kids would be wandering around an abandoned lodge in the middle of the night? I forced myself to act normal for Sophie's sake. "It's just the wind," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Go back to sleep. I'll stay up for a bit." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. I didn't believe me either. For the next hour, I sat in the tent, gripping the flashlight, listening. The whispers never faded completely. Sometimes they were distant, barely noticeable. Other times they came from just outside the thin fabric of the tent. At one point I swore I heard giggling. Light, playful, like kids chasing each other in a game. But every time I gathered the courage to look outside, there was nothing. Just the trees, the empty clearing, the cold night air pressing in. Then just before dawn, everything stopped. 1 second. The whispers were there, just beyond my hearing, just out of reach. The next, silence. Not the gradual stillness of the night fading away, but an abrupt, unnatural void, like whatever had been out there had simply vanished. I didn't move until the sky turned gray with morning light. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the first thing I saw made my blood run cold. Tiny footprints, dozens of them, surrounding our tent in a perfect circle, barefoot, small, like they belonged to children. The dirt was slightly damp from the morning dew, making the prints stand out clearly. They hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. My stomach churned as I followed their pattern. No trail leading in, no trail leading out. Just an endless loop around where we had slept. I felt a presence behind me before I even turned. Sophie had crawled out of the tent, her little stuffed fox clutched in her arms. She looked at the footprints, then up at me. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small. They were here. I didn't know what to say. I just grabbed her hand and squeezed it tight, suddenly desperate to pack up and leave. We didn't eat breakfast. I barely spoke as I broke down the tent, stuffing everything into our packs as fast as I could. The whole time I had this feeling, this sick, crawling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I didn't look toward the lodge. I didn't dare. Sophie stayed quiet, holding onto my sleeve like she understood. Something I didn't. As we finally started down the trail, she tugged at my arm and whispered something that still haunts me. "They said they'll come back when I'm older." Story 4. I've been on plenty of camping trips, but this one sticks with me for all the wrong reasons. It was the summer of 2021, and a few buddies and I had taken a long weekend to hike and camp deep in the Montana wilderness. We weren't amateurs. We had the right gear, enough supplies, and had planned everything down to the last detail. We wanted solitude, real nature, away from crowded campgrounds and RVs blasting music at all hours. And we got it, maybe more than we bargained for. It was the second night, and we were sitting around the fire after a long day of hiking. There were 4 of us, me, Kyle, Mason, and Drew, just kicking back, sipping beers, talking about nothing in particular. The fire crackled, the air was crisp, and everything felt right. That's what I remember most about the moment before it happened, how completely normal it all felt. Then at some point, Mason stopped mid-sentence, his eyes flicking past me. There was a man standing at the edge of our campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. None of us had. 1 second we were alone. The next, he was just there, lingering at the edge of the firelight. He was older, maybe late 50s, dressed in a worn-out flannel and jeans that looked stiff with dirt. He wasn't carrying a pack, didn't have any gear, and he wasn't wearing a headlamp or carrying a flashlight, just standing there staring at the fire like he'd been part of the conversation all along. For a moment, none of us said anything. It was like my brain refused to process it. This man, standing there, completely still, just watching us. Kyle was the first to speak. Hey man, you okay?" His voice was casual, but I could hear the edge in it. The stranger didn't respond right away. He just took a slow step forward, the firelight flickering across his face. His skin was pale, almost grayish, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. Then, finally, he spoke. "Mind if I sit?" His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while. Everything in me screamed no, but none of us knew how to refuse without making the situation worse. So Mason, trying to keep things normal, forced a chuckle. "Yeah, sure, man. You lost or something?" The stranger didn't answer. He just lowered himself onto one of the logs near the fire, rubbing his hands together as if warming them. Even though the night wasn't that cold, something about the way he moved unsettled me. Too slow, too deliberate, like someone who was mimicking human behavior rather than actually feeling it. We kept trying to make small talk, asking him where he came from, if he needed help, but he barely responded. Just nodded, muttered a word here and there. His eyes never met ours, just stayed locked on the flames. The whole time, I had this overwhelming urge to get up, to grab my pack and leave, to do something. But I couldn't. It was like the air around us had thickened, pressing me into place. Then Drew, who had been quiet this whole time, leaned over to grab another beer from the cooler. He turned his head for 1 second, just long enough for all of us to break eye contact with the stranger. And when we looked back, he was gone. Not a sound, not a rustle of leaves, not the crunch of footsteps retreating into the woods. Just gone. 1 second he was there, sitting by our fire. The next, the spot where he had been was empty, except for the log he had been sitting on, still pressed down like it had been holding his weight. Kyle shot up first, whipping his flashlight around the trees. "No way," he muttered, stepping forward like he expected to find the guy crouching in the darkness, waiting. But there was nothing. No movement. No sign of him. Drew swore under his breath, and Mason just sat there, staring at the fire, his hands clenched into fists. "We all saw him, right?" I asked. My voice too loud, too shaky. The looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. Nobody wanted to admit it, but we all felt the same thing. That man had never walked up to our campsite. He had never left it. He had just appeared, and then disappeared. That realization settled over us like a thick fog, suffocating and undeniable. We didn't bother staying up to finish our drinks or tell more stories. We put out the fire, zipped up our tents, and lay there, wide awake, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, when we packed up and left, I kept looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing at the tree line watching us go. I never did, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm sitting around a fire with friends, I catch myself glancing over, half expecting someone to be there, not walking up, not making a sound, just there, watching, waiting. Story 5. I always loved camping. My wife, not so much, but after months of convincing, I finally talked her into a weekend trip, just the two of us, a quiet escape into the woods. We picked a secluded spot in northern Oregon, near a lake, the kind of place where you don't see another soul for miles. It was perfect, at least it should have been. The first day was peaceful. We hiked, swam in the lake, cooked over the fire, and by the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I could tell she was actually enjoying herself. It felt like a victory, getting her to love the outdoors the way I did. That night we crawled into our tent, listening to the distant hoot of an owl, the soft lapping of water on the shore. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel safe, secure. Somewhere in the middle of the night I woke up. No reason at first, just that strange awareness you get when something isn't right. I lay still, listening. At first, all I could hear was the usual forest sounds, until I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps circling our tent. I held my breath. They weren't heavy, not like an animal. They were careful, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. I turned my head slowly, expecting my wife to be asleep, but she was already awake, her eyes wide in the dim light. She had heard it too. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just lay there listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, right there. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whoever or whatever was out there could hear it. My wife gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Then, from just inches away, we heard it. A slow, deep breath, long and deliberate, like someone inhaling through their nose, smelling us. I felt a cold sweat break out along my spine. I reached for the flashlight, moving as quietly as possible. The second my fingers wrapped around it, the breathing stopped. Silence. A silence so deep it felt unnatural, like the whole forest was holding its breath with us. I didn't want to do it. Every instinct in my body screamed, "Don't look," but I had to. With a shaky hand, I unzipped the tent just enough to poke the flashlight through. I clicked it on, sweeping the beam in front of us. Nothing, just the trees, our campfire now reduced to glowing embers. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to shine the light toward the ground, expecting to see footprints, but there was nothing. The dirt was undisturbed, no prints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. I turned off the light and zipped the tent back up, my fingers clumsy with fear. My wife whispered, "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. We lay there for hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and at some point, I drifted off. When I woke up, the sun was rising, the warm glow spilling into the tent, and that's when I saw them. Right outside our tent in the fresh morning dew were footprints. Bare footprints. They led from the edge of the woods straight to our tent, but they stopped there. No trail leading away, just a single set of prints, as if someone had walked up to us in the night and never left. I scrambled out of the tent, my pulse hammering in my ears. The prints were large, longer than my own foot, but narrow, almost unnatural looking. The toes were long, too long, like whoever had made them wasn't quite human. My wife stepped out behind me, gasping when she saw them. "No. Nope. We're leaving." I didn't argue. We packed up in record time, stuffing everything into our bags without bothering to fold or organize. The whole time, I felt exposed, like something was still watching us. By the time we reached the car, my hands were shaking so bad I fumbled with the keys. We didn't talk much on the drive back. What was there to say? What explanation could we possibly come up with that would make sense? That was the last time my wife ever went camping. I've been out since, but never back to that spot. And never alone, because sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear it. The sound of slow, steady breathing, just outside my window. Story 6. Back in 2018, my best friend Connor and I decided to take a weekend camping trip in the Cascades. We were both experienced hikers, had all the right gear, and wanted to push ourselves a little, go deeper into the woods than we usually would, really disconnect. We found a spot about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, completely off the grid. No cell service, no signs of other people. Exactly what we wanted. The first day was great. We hiked up ridges with stunning views, found a small stream where we filled our bottles and eventually settled into a quiet clearing surrounded by towering pines. As we were setting up camp, Connor nudged me and pointed ahead. "Dude, someone's already been here." At the edge of the clearing stood a tent. A single gray, weathered-looking tent zipped up and motionless. It sat perfectly centered in the grass. No signs of a campfire, no gear, no people. Just the tent. It wasn't in bad shape, but something about it felt off, like it had been there for a long time, untouched. We called out, waited. Nothing. No voices, no movement. It was getting late, so we figured whoever owned it had gone on a long hike and would be back soon. We set up our own tent a good 30 feet away, cooked dinner, and tried to ignore the weirdness of it. But as the sun dipped lower, that feeling of wrongness only grew stronger. By the time night fell, the tent was really starting to get under my skin. There was something unnatural about how it just sat there, untouched, silent, like it didn't belong. Connor joked that we should unzip it and check inside, but I shot that idea down fast. It felt like we'd be crossing some invisible line. Like the second we opened that flap, we'd see something we weren't supposed to. Still, we couldn't stop looking at it. Every now and then, one of us would shine a flashlight toward it, half expecting to see movement. But nothing changed. No sounds, no footsteps, just that unmoving, zipped-up tent sitting under the trees. At some point, Connor muttered, I don't think anyone's coming back to that." We both laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind you make when you're trying to convince yourself everything's fine. Eventually, we crawled into our own tent and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly, like my body knew something was wrong before my brain did. The fire had burned low, casting a faint orange glow across the clearing. Everything was still. Too still. Then I realized what had changed. The other tent was gone. I shot up so fast I nearly tore through our own tent. "Connor," I hissed, shaking him awake. "The tent, it's gone." He groaned, half asleep, but when his eyes focused past me, I saw the exact moment his brain caught up. The confusion, the fear. "No way," he whispered. But it was gone. Just gone. We scrambled out into the clearing, scanning the area with our flashlights. There were no footprints, no drag marks, no sign that anything had been there at all. Just an empty patch of flattened grass where the tent had stood. My stomach twisted. Even if someone had come in the middle of the night and packed it up, we would have heard them. We were camped right next to it. There was no way. Connor muttered something under his breath, rubbing his arms like he was cold. I could tell he was trying to come up with a rational explanation, but there wasn't one. The tent hadn't just been packed up. It had been removed from existence, like it was never there to begin with. That was the part that really got to me. We didn't stay for breakfast. We packed up in record time and hiked out of there as the sun started creeping over the trees. Neither of us spoke much, but every now and then Connor would glance over his shoulder, like he expected to see it again. But we never did. And the scariest part? I still don't know if it ever was there in the first place. Story 7. Last fall, a group of us went on a weekend camping trip in Washington State near the Olympic National Park. It was the kind of trip we did every year. Just a bunch of friends looking to unplug, drink a little, and tell stupid stories around a fire. There were 5 of us. Me, Jake, Riley, Mark, and Hannah. We had all known each other for years and none of us were easily spooked. We'd camped in plenty of remote places before, but that night, none of us slept. The day had been perfect. Blue skies, crisp air, and a long hike up to a ridge that gave us a view of the entire valley. By the time we got back to our campsite, the sun was dipping below the trees, and the temperature was dropping fast. We got a fire going, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night. Everything felt normal, safe, but around midnight the fog rolled in. At first it was just a low mist, drifting lazily between the trees, but within minutes it thickened, swallowing the trees, the ground, even the firelight. It wasn't like any fog I'd ever seen before. It moved too fast, like it had a purpose. Within moments we could barely see each other, even though we were sitting just a few feet apart. It was unsettling, but we tried to laugh it off. "Guess we're in a horror movie now," Riley joked. None of us laughed. Then we heard it. A slow, rhythmic sound just outside the circle of our camp. Breathing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was deep, deliberate breathing. Slow and steady, like someone standing just beyond the fog, watching us. Every hair on my body stood up. I glanced at the others, and from the way their faces had drained of color, I knew they heard it too. Mark grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the trees, but the beam barely cut through the thick fog. We couldn't see anything. Hannah whispered, "Hello," her voice barely above a breath. The breathing stopped. Complete, unnatural silence settled over the camp. No wind, no insects, just nothing. Then, a new sound. A soft scraping noise like something dragging across the ground. It started at the edge of the camp and circled us, moving slow, deliberate. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to move, to grab my gear, to run, but my body felt frozen in place. Then Jake did something that made my stomach drop. He grabbed a rock and hurled it toward the sound. It thudded against something solid, not the ground, not a tree, something that made a dull, heavy thump. The second it hit, the fog seemed to shift, swirling unnaturally, almost like it was reacting. And then, a single word appeared in the dirt, right in front of us, written in long, uneven letters. Leave. The second I saw that word, my chest tightened like a vice. Riley let out a sharp breath, stepping back like the letters might reach out and grab him. "Nope, nope, we're done," he muttered, already grabbing his pack. None of us argued. There was no hesitation, no debate. Whatever was out there, whatever had written that, was still watching us. We packed up in record, time moving on pure adrenaline. The whole time the fog didn't lift. It just sat there, dense and unmoving, pressing in on us like a living thing. I could feel eyes on me, even though I never saw a damn thing. Every step toward the trailhead felt like walking through wet cement, like the forest itself didn't want us to leave. And then, just as we reached the edge of the tree line, the fog stopped. It didn't fade. It didn't drift away. It just ended, like a wall separating one reality from another. We stepped through, and suddenly the night was clear, crisp, normal. We turned back, and the campsite was gone. Not just in the fog, gone. We could see where our tents should have been, but there was nothing. No fire pit, no trampled grass, just untouched forest like we had never been there at all. None of us have ever gone back to that area. We don't talk about it much either, but sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I think about that fog, how it moved, how it knew we were there, and I wonder, if we hadn't left, would we have disappeared too? Story 8. I've always been the guy who documents everything. Road trips, birthdays, even random nights out. I'm the one with a camera in hand, capturing the little moments. So when my friends and I went camping in Yosemite last summer, it was no different. I had my DSLR, my phone, even a disposable camera for fun. I wanted to remember every part of the trip, and I did. But there's one thing in those pictures I wish I could forget. There were 4 of us, me, my girlfriend Anna, her brother Luke, and our friend Jamie. We'd planned this trip for months, picking a remote campsite away from the usual tourist crowds. It was perfect. Towering trees, a clear lake nearby, and nothing but wilderness for miles. During the day, we hiked, swam, and lounged by the water. At night, we sat around the fire, taking stupid pictures and making memories. It felt like the kind of trip we'd talk about for years. The weird part started when we got back home. I was going through my photos, sorting them, editing the best ones. That's when I noticed it. In one of the first shots, just a casual picture of Anna and Luke setting up the tent, there was something in the background. A figure. Far back in the trees, barely visible. It wasn't clear, but it was there. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow, maybe. But as I kept scrolling, I saw it again and again, in different pictures from different angles. Sometimes close, sometimes farther back. Always blurred, always just at the edge of the frame. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper we hadn't noticed. Maybe someone had been hiking nearby. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. The figure never moved. It was always standing still, always watching. In one picture, it was by a tree. In another, barely visible between the branches. And in the last photo I checked, taken right before we packed up, it was closer. I felt my stomach twist. I zoomed in, my fingers shaking. It was impossible to make out a face, but there was something wrong with the proportions. The figure was too tall, too thin, and the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't just standing there. It was leaning slightly forward like it was trying to get closer without us noticing. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to freak anyone out over what could have been a weird shadow or a camera glitch. But then Jamie texted me, "Dude, check your photos. Do you see it?" I felt a chill run through me. I called him immediately. He sounded off, nervous, shaken. I thought it was just my imagination, he said, voice hushed. But it's in all of them, every damn one. That's when I finally showed Anna and Luke. Their reactions were immediate. Anna covered her mouth, eyes wide, and Luke muttered, "What the hell?" over and over. We started cross-checking our photos, comparing angles. It didn't matter who took the picture. The figure was always there, and in some of them it was staring directly at us. At that point we were all rattled. We started picking apart our memories of the trip, trying to remember if we had ever seen someone out there with us. But we hadn't. Not once. No other campers, no hikers, just us. And yet something had been watching the entire time. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept flipping through the photos, looking for answers that weren't there. Around 2 a.m., I made a decision. I deleted them. All of them. Every picture with that figure in the background. Jamie did the same. I don't know why, but it felt necessary, like keeping them meant keeping a door open to something we didn't understand. But here's the part that still haunts me. A week later, I was clearing out my SD card, making space for new photos. I scrolled through quickly, not expecting to see anything left. But in the middle of all the blank space where the deleted pictures should have been, there was one file. A single, untouched photo. One I didn't take. It was of our campsite, taken from the woods, from behind us.